Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Hope everybody's having a wonderful Wednesday, or as I found out today, and I didn't realize why I didn't think of this before, because I mean, really makes a lot of sense. But happy Hop Day instead of Hump Day. It's Hop Day because bunnies, and well, I mean, Hump Day and bunnies, whatever. Anyway, so yeah, we've got a fun Mortiel fallacy to talk about tonight, and by fun I mean, I can imagine there's some possibly some heated discussions going to be had in the wake of this discussion, because it's probably not going to be the most popular topic to talk about, because frankly it's going to hurt some people's fifis. Some people's feelings probably are going to get offended by the things I'm going to say on here, because unfortunately in the present day and age, a lot of the things I'm going to talk about tonight are kind of interacting with certain political dynamics that are kind of not that are hot button topics nowadays. So we'll get into that here in a moment. First of all, hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's having a wonderful Wednesday evening. You know, here there's a bit of a snowstorm, so yeah, shit was kind of crazy today. And you know, the roads, of course, never good. Doesn't matter where you go. Doesn't matter how good they take care of the roads. The roads are always bad. Anybody, a lot of places, you know, I have like this kind of like historical, like revisionism, or whatever you call revisionist history. That's the term I'm looking for. This revisionist history, where I'm like, yeah, these other places I've been to, they totally took care of the roads so much better than here, and the roads are so awful here. And then I'm like, that's totally not true. Pretty much every place I live, I always bitch and complain about the roads. If I live in a place where snow has been, then I bitch and complain about the snow and how badly the roads are taken care of. So anybody ever hears me bitching about the roads and saying how they were taken care of so much better in another place, it's a lie. Okay, just like, you know, bringing that up, getting that out of the way so everybody's aware. Anyway, so tonight, our kind of topic of discussion, like I said, it's going to kind of unfortunately delve into some areas that might be seen as a bit intersecting with certain political spheres, unfortunately, because a lot of those political ideologies kind of unfortunately seem ever prevalent in a lot of the things we do today. But it is what it is. And did it really just get rid of all my damn tabs? Screw you, man. Screw you. So give me a moment while I open up all my browser tabs, because Firefox is like, you know, we don't think that you want to see any of this stuff here. So, all right. So let's see. Recently closed tabs. Empty. This is where I just devolve. I'm just like, okay, well, I don't know what to talk about now, so now I'm just gonna kind of blab on about nonsense and blah 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 and stuff. No, there is some interesting topics to go over. Unfortunately, like I said, they're not all well encapsulated in kind of the entire topic that I want to talk about. But essentially what I want to talk about specifically is talking about the kind of dynamic of the corporation versus the consumer, right? And the kind of downside of a lot of kind of how they're portrayed and how people think of them is a little bit misunderstood, I feel. And we're gonna kind of try to be brief and not too long-winded in how I'm talking about it, but it is something that that's really a very complex topic, and we're going to try to focus on a little bit of a specific area of it, and kind of where, in my opinion, a lot of ideals go wrong in the way they react to these ideals. So the first thing we are going to talk about, as our kind of first topic to delve into, is going to be consumerism. Let's get our little browser up here and talk about it. So in consumerism, and a lot of people will kind of say consumerism, and oftentimes I don't really think they understand what they're talking about. But that is the case with a lot of ideologies. Consumerism is an ideology. And that's the first thing that people should always be wary of. They should always be wary of ideologies, because ideologies run the risk of kind of consuming you and becoming almost religion-like in the manner in which you interact with them, where essentially mandates are dictated from on high, and you as the loyal follower of this ideology, you just believe and act upon those mandates from on high as if they are royal decree, which that's always the concern. People should never just blindly follow anything. They should always make it, how, at least ideally, they should have all the information. They should make a choice based upon having all the information they can and actually making the choice to, follow that ideology and continue to check resources as they're following that ideology to keep themselves from becoming kind of blinded to it. Now, there are certain parts of consumerism that I think are healthy, certain parts that I don't think are healthy, and the reaction to consumerism, the main reaction, I should say, I don't really think is necessarily always. It has some good points and bad points as well. The topic is really gray for me, and I kind of want to make sure that that's clear, is that I'm not really a big believer in consumerism or anti-consumerism. That's the main two areas which we're going to talk. We will also talk, as I completely failed to grab it, a completely I hate this term. Neologism. Yes, that's the term. Neologism, right? Sure. Because I actually don't want to talk about the neologism itself. I just actually want to talk very specifically on one portion of it, and we'll get into that in a moment. But let's start with corporatism, or consumerism. Corporatism. Not corporatism. That's something completely different. Consumerism is a social and economic order and ideology that encourages the acquisition of goods and services in ever-increasing amounts. And that's something important to note, is that in consumerism, it's a vacuum, if you will. It's never satiated. It continues to grow. It's never I'm going to have one chocolate. No, I'm going to have one chocolate, and then 2 chocolates, and then 4 chocolates, and then 8 chocolates, and 16, and 32, 64, 128, 256. How long can I keep going with that? 512, 1024, 2048. Anyway, we're stopping there. 4096. God damn it. Point is that there's a lot of consumers just continue to have ever-increasing demand for their products, and businesses also like to stoke ever-increasing demand for their products, because that means they have ever-increasing profits, right? Considering that the monetary resources of the general public seem to be, at least for the most part, finite, the system itself seems to have a fundamental flaw, right? Is that essentially you're saying this ever-increasing vacuum of demand is fueled by a finite amount of resources. Doesn't really make much sense, and that's the truth of it. However, one of the things that you'll notice in a lot of like my criticism of fanboys or people who are fanatics of a certain product, right, is the fact is that they fuel ever-increasing demands, and it often turns sour. As with my criticism of Andromeda, one of the big things I criticized was the actual community around BioWare games and Mass Effect as a whole. and they're not necessarily fanatical for Mass Effect games or BioWare games. They're not necessarily fanatical against. They're fanatical both ways. And the thing is that there's the kind of middle ground gets lost on the internet, just naturally distilling these opinions, where you just hear two extremes. People that hate everything BioWare. Anything BioWare does is just the source of evil. There's always some conspiracy behind what they're doing, etc. And then you have people that are just absolutely everything BioWare does is just a godsend, and you should just blindly buy anything that BioWare produces because they are literally the royal incarnate, or they are the holy incarnate of whatever deity you worship on this earth, and you should follow them as just like that. And that's kind of the distilled opinions you get from the BioWare community, and it's unfortunate because I feel like that's maybe like 1% of the BioWare community. Everybody else falls somewhere in shades in between that, right? And that's kind of with most things nowadays, is that the extremes are the loudest people on there. But in any case, one of the things that when you talk about consumerism, and we're going to kind of go down some of the political climates that are created as a result. But one of the things that BioWare is a good example of is that BioWare has done a good job of stoking an ever-increasing demand from its consumers, of its target audience. The problem is that at what point does that ever-increasing demand become unsustainable? When you continue to produce bigger and bigger blockbusters. It's kind of with Marvel movies. Every Marvel movie that comes out, it seems like the critics and the fans are all like, man, this is literally the best Marvel movie ever. And then the next one comes out, this is the best Marvel movie ever. And then the next one comes out, it's like, how much how much better can each movie get until that bubble bursts, until it becomes an unsustainable level of quality, where say the next the Avengers Infinity War doesn't meet up to that level of hype that literally Marvel has been building over the past 10 years. So that's kind of the major flaw to consumerism, as I see it, is that the whole process, the vicious cycle of it, of consumers having ever-increasing demand and companies wanting to stoke that ever-increasing demand, is an unsustainable loop in many cases. Not all, but many. Now, one of the things that this does talk about here is an almost complete absence of other sustained macro-political and social narratives concerned about global climate change notwithstanding, the pursuit of the good life through practice of what it is known as consumerism has become one of the dominant global forces, cutting across differences of religion, class, gender, ethnicity, and nationality. It is the other side of the dominant ideology of market globalism and the center to what Manfred Steger calls global imaginary. And we're going to talk about the definitions here in a moment, but one of the things on there is that you can see that it doesn't matter. You can go to any country in the world, and wealth and products and getting stuff is almost universally aspired to. You know, you go to the Middle East, you see guys that drive around like in the United Arab Emirates. You see folks that, like the rich folks there, driving around in gold-plated cars. Completely ridiculous, and in all other ways, it's just, you know, useless. There's no functional benefit to it. They do it because they can. They have money. They want to have stuff that says they have money, right? But the thing is, excuse me. The thing is that it doesn't matter what culture, you know. It's kind of the money talks, right? And that's what a lot of consumerism's ideology is built on. Is built on the concept that money is kind of this or I should say wealth, not money necessarily, but wealth and the image of wealth is something that's always aspired to and always chased, and therefore that's where the ever-increasing demand comes from, because there's always more wealth to be obtained and to be flaunted. Even if you don't necessarily have that wealth, you still want to flaunt that wealth. Now, here's the thing, is that when you actually look at the commonly used definitions of consumerism, that's where things become a little tricky. The first definition, and it drives me nuts, by the way, that Wikipedia doesn't understand how to properly tabulate numbered lists, by the way. You're supposed to generally alternate between, like, say, numbers and then letters and then like Roman numerals or something, so that way you can tell what's a sublist of what. But for the sake of it, we have number 1 up here. This is the first guy on our list. Up here, number 1. Oh, you can't see it. This is our number 1, and then this is our number 2 down here. Drives me crazy they did that, but in any case, we're gonna start here. This is the first definition. One sense of the term consumerism relates to efforts to support consumers' interests. By the early 1970s, it had become the accepted term for the field and began to be used in these ways. Consumerism is the concept that consumers should be informed decision makers in the marketplace. Practices such as product testing make consumers informed. Good. Consumerism is the concept that the marketplace itself is responsible for ensuring social justice through fair economic practice. Consumer protection policies and laws compel manufacturers to make products safe. So that's where things kind of get into the more ideological area, right? So the consumerism is the concept that consumers should be informed decision makers. That's kind of an individual ideal, right? It may be an ideology, but it's a personal ideology, right? It's the idea that you or me as individuals should be informed about the products that we're buying, right? So if we are informed, and it's upon the onus is upon the individual to inform themselves, right? If a product say doesn't have reviews or product tests available, it says product testing, but we can insert reviews or any other form of public criticism or inspection of those products to be the same. If a product does not have a form of review or revision to or inspection to it, then as an informed consumer, I should just not buy it because I don't know really what I'm buying. I'm unsure of the product and therefore I don't want it. So that would then drive the company to say, well, our competitors over here are having third parties inspect their products and do reviews of them and do testing of them, and they're selling better, right? So maybe we should do the same thing. Thus, it'll feed the cycle of creating a better place based upon the individual. Now, the second point on here is where, and you could kind of see these two sub-points on here of this as being a very, I guess you could say, an individualist versus a populist kind of sentiment to them, because the second one is very much more populist, right? And it's talking about the marketplace as a community as a whole, right? As opposed to, a consumer should be an informed decision maker themselves, the individual. However, the second point is the marketplace as a society, as a community, is responsible for ensuring social justice through fair economic practices. Consumer protection policies and laws compel manufacturers to make products safe. I guess my issue with this is the marketplace itself being responsible for ensuring social justice through fair economic practices. That is where I kind of have a little bit of difficulty on here, because in the modern day and age, what you run into is you run into corporations that have a big difficulty in being able to separate their greed from their ethics, right? And so their ethics become kind of shoehorned out the side door in order to pursue bigger profits. And that's largely the issue that I run into. Now, consumer protection laws and policies do compel manufacturers to make products safe. Or in general, it does compel them to compete fairly. And that's really the big part of it, is it compels them to compete fairly and ethically. And I think that's kind of, that is a good sentiment. But you have to be careful because, as I've discussed previously on a Mortiel fallacy, ethics is a very subjective area. Your ethics are not the same as my ethics. You know, another person's ethics aren't the same as our ethics. So whose ethics are the right ethics to impose on companies to make products safe? And the answer is usually, hey, we get a group of people together that have differing views, and all of their views are seen as equal, and they kind of come to a middle ground. It's not a one person gets is determined to be the right ethical voice because of some arbitrary standard. For example, like their class, like their level of wealth, their race, nationality, gender, whatever, should not be necessarily the determining factor. It should be, you look at the entire community as a whole, who's represented in that community, wealth levels, like the you know, how many poor people, how many rich people, you know, in between levels, you know, what demographics are you looking at, what cultures might be represented, and then you try to get a baseline of, like, I would say the lowest common denominator of, you know, what those practices might be, and you try to kind of keep the ethics as, I would say, culture neutral as possible. And I guess that's something that really becomes difficult. And that is not a very fondly looked upon opinion nowadays, I think, is that essentially a lot of people want to inject their ideology, their culture, their ethics into everybody else's business. And I feel like that's where you cross the line. So let's just move on here. The third part on third sub-part on this one is consumerism refers to the field of studying, regulating, or interacting with the marketplace. The consumer movement is the social movement which refers to all actions and all entities within the marketplace which give consideration to the consumer. And frankly, that is the most generalist term that is most broadly applied to consumerism. It's literally the act of being a consumer, or in some point consuming in the marketplace. But that's not the only definition. So we had number one, which I missed this sub point on here. This is just one definition, and this seems to be more, you could say, I guess statistically based, or not statistically, what's the right word I'm looking for? This seems to be more coldly based, right? It seems to be more, not objective, that's not the right term. I'm trying to think of the right way to put it. It's just more of the kind of not philosophical. I guess it would be the, I don't know. It's more of a cold way of looking at it, a little bit more emotionless. It's talking about like very vague concepts, right? The second definition is where it's kind of like, this is seen as more of a criticism-based definition. While the above definitions were becoming established, other people became using the term consumerism to mean high levels of consumption. This definition has gained popularity since the 1970s and began to be used in these ways. Consumerism is the selfish and frivolous collecting of products, or economic materialism. In protest against this, some people who, yeah, like there's no, sometimes I really do enjoy, by the way, side note, Wikipedia, some of the community members in there who are reviewing these articles will put in their like more or less smart-ass, citation-needed dumbass into there with as much sarcasm as you can without actually being a smartass. So when they're like, some people, who? What some people? There is, so we'll correct that. Not some people, but instead, in protest against this, there is a concept to promote anti-consumerism and advocate simple living. Consumerism is a force from the marketplace which destroys individuality and harms society. It is related to globalization and protects against this some people. Again, the some people who. But to protest against this, the concept was developed to promote the anti-globalization movement. So as you can tell, this one is a lot more emotionally driven, you know, like selfish and frivolous, and you know, you can tell there's a lot of emotion being in here, where the first one is kind of more cold, and I guess you could say almost not scientific, but it's more, it's kind of looking at fact-based and kind of trying to be more objective in the way that it's looking at things. Whereas this one is more of getting into the emotional, the qualitative. That, I guess that's a good one. The first definition is more quantitative. It's looking at the numbers, the kind of cold hard facts of it. Whereas this one's kind of looking at the feelings of people on there. And there is a big movement of people who see the idea of consumerism, of buying things to kind of you know, frivolously spending things that you don't need. Like, oh, I don't know, shiny web camera or a fancy microphone, or, you know, 20,000 monitors, 2 computers. These are things I don't necessarily need, right? They're things that I wanted. And therefore, I might be guilty of consumerism. And therefore, I could be seen as an economic materialist and, you know, essentially someone who is a bad person because I have a... what was it? I believe someone said I have a technology fetish, right? It's not a sexual thing. It's not. I don't know why they call it a fetish. Anyway, point is that this one is derived in emotion. And the major one is the idea that consumerism is a force from the marketplace that destroys individuality and harms society. And you would say, well, that is really not true, right? Because consumerism, it's all about the consumers having the choice. Yes, right? You know, like, I'm a consumer. I choose what I want to do. I'm an individual. I have the power. But there are concerns in that, and that's where we get into the gray areas. This isn't necessarily wrong, mind you, even though it is qualitative and kind of more emotionally driven. It's not necessarily wrong. This is a lot of gray area, and that's kind of the catch of it, right? Is that you kind of run into problems where a lot of these opinions are kind of not necessarily wrong, not necessarily right. They're just opinions. And whenever someone says, oh, consumerism destroys individuality, your initial gut reaction, or a lot of people I know, their initial gut reaction is, no, it doesn't. You know, it promotes individuality. It gives you individual expression based upon what you buy, you know, defines you, and therefore you have individual choice and agency in that. But conversely to that, by you being defined by what you buy, and you only hearing about what you buy through advertisements or through social circles, your individuality then becomes determined by the social circle and the advertising circle and the target demographic that you're a part of. Ergo, your individuality thus disappears. Which is a very, like I said, that's where there's no right or wrong answer here. It can destroy individuality, but it can promote individual expression. So it's kind of a yes and no, and that's where I have a lot of the problem of it, is at what point your consumerism actually is based upon your target demographic, or where it's based upon your entirely individual choices. And that's where the trick is on here. So where's the criticism section? We're gonna get down to that here. Ooh. No, that's mass production in 21st century. Okay, so this is the kind of going into those downsides here. Since consumerism began, various individuals and groups have consciously sought an alternative lifestyle. These movements range on the spectrum from the moderate, simple living, eco-conscious shopping, the localvore, or buying local, and freeganism. The names people come up with. Localvore, freeganism. Anyway, freeganism's on the extreme end. That's, as far as I understand, that's where you're like really focused on free shit and getting free stuff wherever you can. You also might see like a derivation of freeganism being kind of the popularism of discount stores and like thrift shopping, where you get really expensive stuff for really cheap, couponing, that sort of thing. So those can kind of get on extreme ends. But anyway, building on these movements, ecological economics is a discipline that addresses the macroeconomics, social and economic or ecological implications of primarily consumer-driven economy. So ecological economics looks at the broad, it looks at the big picture, and it tries to see the ecological implications of it. In many critical contexts, consumerism is used to describe the tendency of people to identify strongly with products or services they consume. And this is where we're getting into fanboyism here, especially with the commercial brand names and perceived status symbolism. They actually got the word right and they didn't say symbology. The symbolism appeal, ergo a luxury car, designer clothing, or expensive jewelry. Consumerism can take extreme forms, such as the consumers sacrifice significant time and income not only to purchase, but to actively support a firm or brand. Yes. So here's the thing, is that in that point where that becomes a problem, now here's where it's okay. I buy something, I, say buy a drink from a place, right? I drink that drink and I'm like, yeah, this tastes pretty good. I like this. And then I tell my friends, I tweet it out on Twitter, I post up on Facebook, man, I really like this drink. I got it from this one place. That, I say, is okay. Where it goes wrong, and where I think it crosses a line, is at one point where I say, I really like this drink. I bought this from this place. And someone else is like, you like this drink? That I found it to be gross. And my response is, well, you're stupid. That's where we get into the wrong territory there. At what point you become tribal and you start attacking people that you perceive to be part of an enemy tribe, ergo a person who has a different opinion from you. That's a problem. You shouldn't be attacking them. Like, well, why did you find it to be gross or whatever? And you could find out, oh, they had a different flavor of the drink than you. Well, that would answer that. But the instinct, especially nowadays in our online culture, is instead to immediately attack that person that has the wrong opinion as you see it from your viewpoint. That's where I feel like this level of consumerism kind of goes into a dark place. Is at what point you're attacking people that have a differing opinion on a certain brand or firm. Now, opponents of consumerism argue that many luxuries are unnecessary and consumer products may act as a social mechanism, allowing people to identify like-minded individuals through the display of similar products. Again, utilizing aspects of status symbolism to judge socioeconomic status and social stratification. Some people believe that relationships with a product or brand name are substitutes for healthy human relationships lacking in society. Oh God, we're gonna get into that. along with consumerism, create a cultural hegemony and are part of a general process of social control in modern society. Whoo, shit, that's getting into dark territory here. So, so people believe that relationships with a brand or a product or a brand name are substitutes for healthy human relationships. So, I feel like I might need to actually find out this source link here. I really feel like I need to go to this source link. So what was that? Was that 32? I feel like the theory of the leisure class. I'm gonna research that for later. Anyway, moving on. I'm just curious because that is that's some crazy ass shit that's claiming there. So to translate that, it's essentially saying that so I went to Costa Vida. I got some tacos. Tacos. I also got some horchata. Horchata. So, god damn it, they should be paying me for that advertisement. Anyway, point is that at what point I think that Costa Vida as a concept, not as the actual establishment itself, but as a concept, Costa Vida to me is a friend. The company, the ambiguous company, the logo is a friend that I can interact with, have conversations with. I can chill and relax with them. That's a little bit scary. That, to me, would primarily denote a certain level of mental instability more than anything. So then the second thing, now getting into the BioWare concept on there, there's running joke, but not really a joke, of how many people, and there's a lot of people out there that kind of have this concept where the romance options that you have in like Mass Effect or Dragon Age, to them are more real than their actual real life, significant others or potential significant others therein. That I don't see as necessarily the same thing. That's not viewing BioWare itself as a significant other. That's just you being attached to a fictional character involved under that brand. That's the fictional character you like, not the brand. And I think that's a separation there. Still a little bit unhealthy, I'm not gonna lie, but to each their own. I don't think that necessarily says you're crazy. It just says you like a fictional character. Whatever. But if you start actually talking to the BioWare logo on the background of your computer, maybe building a shrine to BioWare or something like that, that's where we need to start being concerned. Anyway, and along with consumerism, they create a cultural hegemony. Essentially, this brand creates a subset culture that is unto itself ruling. For example, and this is actually a good example of a cultural hegemony built around a product, Apple. So Apple has built this ecosystem, this marketing model, which was actually ingenious, and I think a lot of it was designed, if I remember correctly, by Steve Jobs. In his kind of, it all started with the iPod, really, back in the early 2000s when he was trying to revive the dying Apple company. And what he originally tried to do was kind of create this culture of exclusivity. Like you have this icon of social well-being. Like if you have an iPod, you were cool, you were awesome. Everybody would recognize those white earbuds hanging out of your ear, and they would know you're one of the in crowd, right? To the point where people were actually targeted for theft based merely upon them having white earbuds in their ear. Not a joke. If you look back at some of the news articles back from the early 2000s, people were like, whenever the new iPod model would come out, people on subways and in public places would get targeted for theft because they had the white earbuds in, and people would know they had a brand new expensive iPod that they could then pawn off on the street or whatever and get some money back. You made you an instant target. That in itself created this subculture of kind of wealth and a distinction, which then continued with the iPhone, which again then created this little subset of people. And now there's this kind of almost joke stereotype of the hipster who's hanging out in Starbucks with his MacBook and his iPhone, his iPod, his iPad. You know, he's just surrounded by a bunch of half-eaten rotten fruit, and his brain might as well be owned by the Apple Corporation, right? That is kind of a joke stereotype, but the truth is that that is a lot of what the marketing around Apple creates, is that if you own an Apple product, you are part of an exclusive club, an exclusive society that kind of rules itself and sets its own rules, right? You're separated from the rest of society. You set your own rules within the Apple family, within the Apple culture. That's a cultural hegemony, and that's what they're talking about there. And that is kind of scary because it really defeats the self-autonomy, the self-agency of consumerism. So it's kind of that dichotomy there. Now, critics of consumerism often point out that consumerist societies are more prone to damage to the environment, contribute to global warming, and use up resources at a higher rate than other societies. Right. So Dr. George Mayfud, I may be mispronouncing that, sorry, says that trying to reduce environmental pollution without reducing consumerism is like combating drug trafficking without reducing drug addiction. That actually is a horrible... That makes no sense. So the statement there, trying to reduce environmental pollution without reducing consumerism, is like combating drug trafficking without reducing drug addiction. So what he's trying to say is that reducing environmental pollution will invariably reduce consumerism, which I don't think is actually the case. All you have to do is just change the mode of consumerism, right? So consumerism and the consumer market, I should say, is very amiable, is very malleable. It can be shaped and changed. It's all about, and that's where kind of the you get the driving force of the companies. If the companies choose to produce less pollution, be cleaner and be more eco-friendly and that sort of thing, but then they get the correct advertising behind it and still produce products that their customers want, they can still go clean and produce less pollution without actually sacrificing the consumerism ideal. An example of this would be, and now this is a controversial segment of it, but as a whole, trying to get away from using fossil fuels has always been difficult, because especially in the United States, there's the American muscle, kind of concept where owning your car is a right of manhood or womanhood, whatever. Point is that it's very, very difficult to create a divide, get your foot in the door if you want to get people away from using fossil fuels and oil, which are known pollutants. But trying to get people away from those is very difficult if you can't get your foot in the door because of this culture clash of the Americans believing that American muscle is the ideal car, right? And in comes Elon Musk, right? Now, Elon Musk was not the first person to come up with a hybrid or an electric vehicle or anything of the sort. In fact, there have been alleged electric vehicles as far back as the 1800s. And then supposedly there's conspiracy theories, unproven conspiracy theories that automobile manufacturing companies, oil companies bought up a whole bunch of electric car patents to try to, essentially not have any threats to their, thing, whatever. Those are unproven, but you get the kind of idea that they've been around for a long time. So electric cars, hybrids, they're not new. However, in a lot of modern society, you didn't hear people talking about electric cars or talking about hybrids a whole lot. But then, you know, this Elon Musk guy comes out and he brings out this car called a Tesla. And it's a damn pretty looking car. It's a luxury car, it's pretty fast, and it's electric. So what did he do? He targeted the top of the food chain. Well, not necessarily the really top, but he targeted the upper middle class, right? He targeted those that are essentially, there's a kind of a concept that we'll probably talk about a little bit on here, but there's a concept in targeting demographics for a lot of companies where essentially where you find your target demographic is you look at the point where you're targeting a group that wants to emulate a group higher than themselves, right? Which is very common in consumerism theory, is that people as a group, as a society, tend to buy products in order to try to emulate those in the class above them, right? So if you have the top 1%, right, they don't really buy products to emulate the class above them, right? They are the class above them, right? There's no one above them. So they just buy whatever, you know, whatever they have, you know, whatever is their style of living, right? They could have a boat, they could have a helicopter, a private jet. Those are things that they use probably most often for either leisure, legitimate leisure that they actually enjoy, or for the sake of utility. Like a private jet sounds pretty fancy, right? Well, but they actually have just become accustomed to traveling privately. They're super rich and they need to fly a lot. So owning a private jet makes financial sense to them. To folks of us that are in the normal world, owning a private jet seems just ridiculous and frivolous. It's just a difference in culture, honestly. However, when you're at the upper middle class level, you're rich enough to afford some pretty good things, but you also still are one rung below the top, right? You're not upper class, you're upper middle class. So you still tend to have the urge to buy stuff to try to emulate being upper class, right? So that's where Tesla targeted. They had like, I think it was like the first Tesla was like $70,000 or something like that, which is like kind of getting in your BMW Mercedes grade area, which is the sweet spot for a lot of luxury cars, because your extreme luxury cars that are several $100,000 or maybe upwards of $1 million, that's stuff that the super elite are buying, that top upper crust, right? Whereas, you know, those folks that are not quite that upper class level, they want to buy the BMWs, the Mercedes, stuff like that, because that emulates them being upper class, even if they're not. That's what Tesla targeted, and it was a hit. A lot of people liked it because, A, first of all, it was that top-end luxury car that upper middle class folks love, and it was hipster too. It was cool because it was electric. It was fast, it was sleek, it was a pretty car, and guess what? It actually was the start of kind of the new electric car revolution that's slowly picking up speed, right? He's also been pushing a lot of other things that may end up reducing overall environmental pollution in the long run. Now, the problem with electric cars is buying a new electric cars over the short term does have an environmental impact for the actual production of the car, because batteries themselves are not the most environmentally friendly. So it's essentially not necessarily it is cleaner while the car remains in use, but manufacturing of it does have an impact. So the idea is getting them into production, getting them onto the field, getting everybody behind the wheel of electric cars has an initial kind of impact to the environment. But if right now we swapped all cars with electric cars, the manufacturing impact of making those electric cars would be catastrophic. But over the course of the next 50 years, as there are no more pollution emitting cars out there, our overall carbon emissions would reduce. The nitric oxide emissions would reduce. So we would overall be polluting less, but that initial impact would be catastrophic. So it's kind of that catch-22. So reducing pollution, you sometimes have to change modes of it, but I feel like you can reduce pollution and still maintain consumerism, because the Tesla, it reduces carbon pollution, right? Carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, oxides of nitrogen. It reduces all three of those things and still maintains a lot of consumerism. People want that. It's a status symbol, right? So it still maintains it. So that's where I kind of don't buy that line. And we're going to skip this. We're going to get down to this one because I feel like this is a juicy bit on here. So William Rees of the University of British Columbia and an epidemiologist, Warren Hearn of the University. Is that really a field, studying epidemics? Really? I mean, it not even necessarily viral. So you're not like a chemist, you're not a biologist, you're not a geologist studying earthquakes. So you're not a chemist studying biological weapons. You're not a biologist studying viruses, like a microbiologist studying viruses. You're not a geologist studying earthquakes. You're not a meteorologist studying tornadoes or hurricanes. You're just generally studying epidemics as a philosophical concept, I guess. Anyway, my jokes aside, they said that human beings, despite considering themselves civilized thinkers, are subconsciously still driven by an impulse for survival, domination, and expansion. An impulse which now finds expression in the idea that an inexorable economic growth is the answer to everything and, given time, will redress all the world's existing inequalities. Woo. Woo. Wow. So he started that statement started off so right. It was like shooting for the moon. And then the rocket exploded in the sky and rained down fire on everybody watching. Subconsciously, people are still driven by an impulse for survival, domination, and expansion, an impulse which now finds expression in the idea that... So, subconsciously, people are still driven by an impulse for survival, domination, and expansion. Not necessarily domination and expansion, it's purely survival. It's all back to survival, right? Not necessarily survival of the individual, but survival of the species. And how that works is it's a survival of the individual means survival of the species. If I am able to survive and procreate, then my species will survive. And in doing so, prove to nature that my genes are strong enough to survive. In the concept that over many hundreds of years, or many thousands, or many millions of years, that over time, weaker strains of our mutations that might come up would die off due to exposure to nature, predators, etc. Whereas the stronger, faster, smarter, whatever dominant traits you want to say on there, that were able to overcome exposure to the elements and to predators and so on, would survive on, therefore coming out to a more strong species. That's basic survival of the fittest. It all comes down to survival. Domination and expansion are all about survival in the base instinct of the brain, in the base instinct of the brain. By dominating an area, you remove out rivals, so therefore your gene pool is allowed to survive the strongest. B, your predators are gone because you have dominated the area. And then continuing to expand is a natural state of survival, because the idea, at least in your primal brain, as far as I understand the concept, expansion comes into the natural thing of allowing you to create a larger clan for survival. You know, the more space you have, the more people or the more animals or whatever can be in that area, therefore the more likelihood you are to survive. The more area you're in, the more food you have, the more water you have, the more resources in general you have, therefore the better able you are to survive. This is the basic primal instinct of all animals. Boil it all down, boil everything you do down, it's always going to come back to survival. The only difference between humans and other animals that are more instinct driven is that we've just built layers of intelligence on top of it. Some animals have some of those layers themselves, other ones have less, some have more, but we are at the top of the intelligence layers to the point where we're kind of building some layers that aren't so intelligent on there as well. Anyway, but this excuse me, but this impulse, which now finds expression in the idea that inexorable economic growth is the answer to everything. I don't think that is entirely accurate, though. I don't think that that's where it finds its expression. I don't think that it's the economic growth is the answer to everything. I think where the survival instinct gets its expression nowadays is that materialism and consumerism and essentially being generally more wealthy is attributed to being more likely to survive. That's where your brain is tricked things. So your economic wealth, the material that you have, is inexorably tied to your survival. Even though it's not, you're going to survive very likely. I mean, except if some unfortunate incident were to happen. That's not a threat. I promise I'm not threatening anybody. I'm sounded like I'm an Italian mobster there. Hey, maybe an unfortunate accident were to happen. Anyway, no, no. Barring any tragic incident, your survival is going to happen no matter what. But it's all about who survives better, and I don't mean who is better able to survive. I mean as in who survives in more style, who survives in more luxury, who survives more attractive, faster, better, stronger, more attractive. You know, any of these like traits that you can attribute on there. It's just more about who is better able to survive, who's doing it better, who's winning, right? That's really what it's about. That's where the expression is translated in modern society. Whereas the petty ways that you see survival instinct bleeding out into society. And you guys can feel free to add your own in the comments, but my favorite is the lawn war. So you go to suburban America, and I love this. This is something that I had not experienced before. But in the United States, there's this concept, like in suburban America, where the neighbors compete over who has the greenest grass, the most evenly trimmed lawn, the thickest grass that looks really full and looks really lush and green. Yes, if I have better grass than my neighbor, that means that I am doing better at surviving. What? That makes no fucking sense. In any sense of the word, that makes no sense at all. But it is where the survival instinct has bled over, because, and that's the same thing with, like, for example, sports fans, not players. Even players, it makes more sense. You're actually mimicking, even if you're playing soccer or American football, if you're playing basketball, baseball, whatever, the competition of it for those athletes is mimicking a fight for survival. It's obviously several major degrees removed from actual fighting, unless you're doing boxing or MMA fighting or wrestling or whatever. But those sports, the mainline sports, are several major degrees removed from actual fighting for survival. But the combat, the competition, the violence of them, and when I mean violence as a an ethereal as a metaphysical concept, not as literally most people think of being violent as like hitting someone or trying to kill someone. I mean violence as in tumultuousness, as something being upset and out of balance, right? The kind of violence, the act of clashing, the friction between two sides and one prevailing is kind of the core of a lot of survival instinct, is you're now better able to survive because you've triumphed over your competition, right? But the fanatics even of sports also still boils down to that survival instinct. By me choosing the right sports team that wins, that means that I am surviving better than that guy who's a fan of the other sports team. Or as they themselves try to insert themselves into being a part of the team winning. Like, even if the guy is, in his mid-50s, overweight, and sitting on a chair or couch watching the sports game, he inserts himself in there as kind of a vicarious exploration of being a part of the team, right? He's responsible for the quarterback making that touchdown pass. I've heard actual guys, like fans of sports, saying, yeah, see, that's what happens when you do what I tell you. Dude, you're watching this on TV. You didn't do what you told him. You coincidentally, said the thing that they also would do because it was the smart move to make. That wasn't your fault. You didn't do it. You're just watching. But bringing it back on here, that concept of competition, tribalism, that all boils down to survival instinct. It's not the idea that economic growth is the answer. It's the act of me being better than you is what boils down to survival instinct. That's where it's expressed today, is that I'm not necessarily needing to actually literally survive, but I just need to survive better than you and be cooler than you, be smarter than you. That's what it's all about. That's where it's expressed nowadays. Now, and then the idea that economic growth will eventually redress all the world's existing inequalities. No, in fact, I don't know of anybody who actually has that idea, even subconsciously. I don't know of anybody that expresses that, except maybe if they are some extremely wealthy people that think that lessening financial burden on themselves will somehow trickle down to the folks that are less financially advantaged than they are. That, of course, trickle-down economics, as that's called, has been proven to never work and is a complete sham, and I will call it out as such every fucking time. Trickle-down economics does not work. Pure and simple. But that is about the only group that I feel that think that economic growth will somehow redress world's inequalities. That's the only group I can think of. So I feel like this statement is disingenuous in that second half. The first half, people are still driven by survival instinct. Yes, it's just warped and translated. It's evolved as our society has grown, but not the way that they said. So anyway, according to the figures presented by Rees at the annual meeting of Ecological Society of America, human society is in a global overshoot, consuming 30% more material than is sustainable from the world's resources. And this is something I was talking about at the very beginning. If you remember what I was saying, that vacuum, that infinite consumption cycle where you consume ever greater amounts of something, and the businesses encourage you to continue consuming ever greater amounts of stuff, is unsustainable because of the lack of resources, right? That's exactly what this is saying here. But Rees went on to state that at present 85 countries are exceeding their domestic biocapabilities and compensate for their lack of local material by depleting the stocks of other countries, which have a material surplus due to their lower consumption. that's not exactly the way it works, right? Some countries have a surplus of materials because they have more materials, right? For example, countries that are, say, for example, a desert country, right? If they're like, say, Libya, well, no, actually, well, yeah, even for the most part, Libya, or, you know, say for a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, have a very little amount of trees, right, in the country. The coastal parts of Libya, for example, the Mediterranean coast, as far as I remember, does have trees, but as you get southward into the country, there's a distinct lack because of this small little thing called the Sahara, right? Kind of, and it's the upper Sahara area where it's more arid, if I remember correctly, and it's pretty devoid of a lot of trees. Excuse me. Their lack of trees is not due to the fact that they overconsume them. It's due to the fact that they're in a fucking desert. Okay? Now, for example, conversely, you go south into, say, the Republic of Congo, just a few countries south, right? They have an overabundance of trees. But they don't have nearly as much oil, right? Which, of course, oil in the modern market is worth a lot more than trees, but whatever. We're just using these as pure material substances, not necessarily with a monetary value attached. So the thing is that whereas they have more trees, they have more materials for building stuff, whereas Libya has less, right? That's a simple thing. It's not because the Republic of Congo is consuming less trees. They are more than likely consuming a lot more trees than Libya because, well, Libya doesn't have a lot of trees to consume, whereas Congo has trees galore. You could chop down trees for days. Well, you don't want to do that because you actually want to kind of keep the rainforests around. They are very helpful, but you know, you could chop down trees for days in Congo and probably only make a small dent. Now you chop down trees for years, which is a problem that a lot of rainforests have had, both in Africa and South America. You can actually deforest them, and that is a big problem. So you don't want to do that. But I'm saying that you could chop down trees for days in the Congo, and you would have thousands of more trees than you would in Libya, because Libya just simply doesn't have the trees. So attributing resource levels to countries in their surplus of them entirely to the amount they consume is disingenuous. Yes, there are countries that are notoriously bigger consumers. China, for example, which, by the way, China is not necessarily capitalistic. So I don't know if you guys remember earlier, there was a claim up above that essentially major capitalist countries are the biggest consumers in the world. Well, China is not necessarily capitalist. They're a little weird. They're technically a communist country, but they have special economic zones that have capitalistic kind of rules to them. And then there's Hong Kong, which is also confusing, but it's complicated. Their relationship status on Facebook it's complicated. But the point is that they are one of the world's largest consumers. They also have varying degrees of resources of different types. But one of the ones that they don't have is they run into issues with a lot of farmland because there's a lot of... Their whole country is not flat. One of the major benefits that the United States have, aside from the fact that it's, I think about 1/3 the size of, like population-wise, it's 1/3 the population of China, is that we have a large stretch of flat land through the middle of the country. We've produced so much corn that the government were paying farmers in the middle of the United States not to fucking grow corn. We were producing way too much, and then now we're like, oh, you know what? Actually produce more corn because ethanol can be made from corn. However, the point is that China is a major consumer of goods, right? their level of consumption is probably drastically higher than the ability of them to produce. But their rate of consumption and the amount of materials they had to consume are not directly in proportion to each other, right? They're not directly affected by each other. It's all because the country itself doesn't necessarily have a lot of the, say, certain faculties for those resources. And I feel like that's something that is a common argument you'll hear of, that essentially, and this is boiling down to imperialism, right? England, for example, they went out and colonized a bunch of areas. They colonized, Northern Ireland, they colonized India, Hong Kong, and what was it, like 5-6 other places they had colonies in. United States, of course, as well. But the thing is that they were colonizing partly to explore, but partly because they just wanted to get their dick in everything. Let's be honest, that's what it was. The thing is that their ability to consume resources in England wasn't necessarily limited, because the island is relatively small and wasn't that many people there at the time. They were just producing goods for the sake of producing goods. And that was actually a major problem with England at the time, is that they were producing goods which had very little demand for it. Now there's becoming a greater demand for goods and not enough necessarily production worldwide. Anyway, now, where are we at? Not only that, McCracken indicates that the only way in which consumer goods and services are bought, created, and used should be taken under consideration when studying consumption. So, I'm not sure exactly what that's supposed to mean, though. That doesn't really say anything. That's a non-statement. But when you study consumption, I guess, like, that's... yes, you should consider that the way they're bought, created, and used. I mean, that... I guess created and used would be important, but the implication of consuming is that they're bought somehow. I don't know. Anyway, furthermore, some theorists are concerned with the place of commodity takes, or the place commodity takes in the definition of oneself, and this is where I really get into my area, my wheelhouse, so to speak. Media theorist Strauss Ewan coined the term commodity self to describe an identity built by the goods we consume. For example, people often identify as a PC or a Mac user. By the way, I have both. I don't fucking care. Or define themselves as a Coke drinker rather than Pepsi. Cherry Pepsi is better. Coke, oh no, Cherry Coke is also good. Damn it, yeah. Again, don't give a fuck. The ability to choose one product out an apparent mass of others allows a person to build a sense of unique individuality. Despite the prevalence of Mac users, or the nearly identical... Wait, prevalence of Mac users? Mac users are the drastic minority, like less than 10%. What are you talking about, prevalence of Mac users? Or the nearly identical taste of Coke and Pepsi. Yeah. Oh, I see what he's saying. He's not necessarily saying they're prevalent. He's saying despite whether there's prevalence of Mac users or the nearly identical taste of Coke or Pepsi. By owning a product from a certain brand, one's ownership becomes a vehicle of presenting an identity that is associated with an attitude of the brand. The idea of individual choice is exploited by corporations that claim to sell uniqueness, and this is what we were talking about with Apple earlier. They claim to sell uniqueness and the building blocks of an identity. The invention of commodity self is a driving force of consumerist societies, preying upon the deep human need to build a sense of self and a sense of community. It's both. It's in its both self. You have the tribal and you have the individual, right? The tribe, you know, kind of that feeling of community, that feeling of being around people that accept you and love you and that sort of thing, is also an important driving factor in a lot of animals, including humans. in the sense of individuality and self is also an important concept for at least humans, as not many animals seem to have. I think elephants demonstrate self-awareness, but whatever. In any case, those are both key components in a selling fashion for a lot of companies. They will sell you kind of a sense of individuality, and or it could be one, a mix or the other, a sense of community. Apple does both. They both sell you an image, an ideal image of yourself that you could be, but they also offer you a ticket to a kind of a unique club that you get to be a part of. So you get both the sense of self and the sense of community. Not all anti-consumerists oppose consumption in and of itself, but they argue against increasing the consumption of resources beyond what is environmentally sustainable. And they go crazy places with it too. Jonathan Porritt writes that consumers often are unaware of the negative environmental impacts of producing many modern goods and services, and that the extensive advertising industry yeah, crazy time. It must be later than it is. Advertising industry only serves to reinforce increasing consumption. Yes, it does. Likewise, other ecological economists such as Herman Daly and Tim Jackson recognize the inherent conflict between consumer-driven consumption. Really? Consumer-driven consumption. Anyway, planet-wide ecological degradation. There's not a conflict between consumer-driven consumption and planet-wide ecological degradation. There may be a correlation, is what you're looking for. Correlation. Anyway, so in what it's saying is this is kind of almost defending the anti-consumerist thing without actually telling you what the anti-consumerist viewpoint is. And anti-consumerism, as we're going to get into, is actually kind of the anti-ideology of consumerism, but not always on the right way. And we'll get into this here. Anti-consumerism is a socio-political ideology. Remember, ideology, be very wary of them because they could potentially lead to kind of almost religious-like fanaticism. So be wary of ideologies that is opposed to consumerism, at least somewhat. They're not always directly opposed. The continual buying and consuming of material possessions. Now, if you remember, we talked about two different definitions of consumerism. And this is where I said it's not always directly opposed. Consumerism has that kind of quantitative studying the numbers and the kind of the science of how a consumer market works, a little bit definition. But then we also have the second definition that was more qualitative, that was talking about the feelings of consumerism, of consuming things massively. That's what this is opposed to. So the second definition of consumerism. In any case, anti-consumerism is concerned with the private actions of business corporations in pursuit of financial and economic goals at the expense of public welfare. Oh, why are you so much? Probably because I'm talking too much. Especially in matters of environmental protection, social stratification, and ethics in the governing of society. In politics, anti-consumerism overlaps with environmental activism, anti-globalization, and animal rights activism. Not completely. It doesn't completely overlap them. It might intersect with them somewhat, but not entirely. Moreover, a conceptual variation of anti-consumerism is post-consumerism, living in a material way that transcends consumerism. We're not going to go down the rabbit hole of post-consumerism. So when we talk about neologisms, whatever, neologisms, when we talk about that, that's kind of what post-consumerism, by the way. It's a hate that word. Neologism. Ha! Got it. It's a neologism. So anti-consumerism arose in response to the problems caused by the long-term mistreatment of human consumers and of the animals consumed, and the incorporation of consumer education to school curricula. I don't know why it's... Oh, I see what it's saying. Examples of anti-consumerisms are the book No Logo by Naomi Klein. Oh, we're not gonna go through all of these guys. I don't... You guys want to read the books, fine, whatever. This is just the Wikipedia page for anti-consumerism. It's not anything fancy. The criticism of economic materialism as a dehumanizing behavior that is destructive of the earth as a human habitat. You guys remember that second definition I was talking about there that was destroying the individual, right? This comes from religion and social activism. The religious criticism asserts that materialist consumerism interferes with the connection between individual and their deity. Not necessarily God, just their deity. It interferes with it. And so is inherently immoral style of life. Thus, the German historian Oswald Spengler said that life in America is exclusively economic in structure and lacks depth. From the Roman Catholic perspective, Thomas Aquinas said that greed is a sin against God, just as all mortal sins, inasmuch as man condemns things eternal. For the sake of temporal things. Ugh. We get it. There's a lot of guys that said spiritual inspiration guided to simple living. Yeah, a lot of people have said that. From the secular perspective, social activism indicates that by the way, secular takes on a really unique meaning when we consider the ideologies oftentimes espouse almost religious-like fanaticism. So keep that in mind when we say the word secular. Social activism indicates that from consumerist materialism derived crime, which originates from the poverty of economic inequality, which is not necessarily created by consumerism. However, it is oftentimes worsened by consumerism. So that's something to keep in mind here, is that materialism doesn't create economic inequality. Industrial pollution and the consequence of environmental degradation and war is a business. I swear I'm not that bored with reading this. About the societal discontent born of malaise and hedonism, Pope Benedict said that the philosophy of materialism offers no raison d'etre for human existence. Likewise, writers George D. Hummel said that human materialism is a beacon of mediocrity and threatens to eclipse the French civilization. So here is one thing when we're talking about anti-consumerism, and you can kind of get the sense of what's going on here, is essentially they say that it destroys your individuality, it causes war and environmental degradation and crime and poverty and economic inequality and all these things. It causes all these bad problems, except it's not necessarily the cause, or at least it's not the sole cause of all these problems. The other thing on there is that, as I said before, that consumerism has a kind of gray area with the individuality. On one point, you do have the commodity self. Essentially, what you buy allows you to define your individuality, but at the same time, buying things in a target demographic that other people in a target demographic buy also loses your identity as well. So it's kind of it's a gray area. Neither side is necessarily right. That's something else as well. Now here's the thing. There was a good argument that I heard made whenever people are talking about a lot of, and this is generally a populist position, where they discuss the economic inequality, right, or just general inequality around everywhere. Is that the lack of inequality? If everybody, and when I say inequality, I mean that right now everybody had everything stripped away, and they were all given $1 million. Everybody all across the world, everything stripped away, all possessions, all material possessions, everything they have stripped away. They're all given, you know, $1 million right now. And, you know, let's say all houses, everything was torn down, all businesses gone, everything's gone, world's flat, just a bunch of humans, nothing else. We're all given $1 million, and we all have the tools and the resources to build whatever we want, right? That isn't necessarily inequality right there, right? You know, everybody has the same start, but you'll eventually kind of get a tribal development going on, whatever. The problem becomes in our society that is already developed, it's already established, it's not a flat thing, and there isn't everybody there with just $1 million. Is if you force essentially equality into an unequal situation, what happens is that people no longer like innovation essentially dies, because if they're, and this is where things are a balance, it's not a one or the other, it's not a dichotomy, right? It's a gray area. You have to find a balance in between. And I know people that are on the extreme populist side or the extreme nationalist side hate people that are in the center because they hate people that are logical and make sense. I know, it sucks. But here's the thing, is that whenever people are talking a lot about consumerism, one of the things that they kind of tend to fail at is finding that middle ground. They tend to go one side or the other. Either it's all evil all the time, or it is all that you should ever strive for. And the answer is kind of somewhere in between. If you take away economic inequality completely, which is something to strive for, I do admit it would be nice if we did not have poverty, because it would reduce a lot of problems. If we didn't have people starving, if we didn't have homeless people, etc., etc., those are nice things to strive for. However, if you force them, if you have some group dictate that the rich should give up half of their wealth and give it to the poor, right? Economic redistribution, right? Something right-wingers, nationalists tend to be very adamantly opposed to in the United States. Anything of that sort is, ooh, it's like, it might as well be Hitler having anal sex with Satan to them, like straight up the worst thing in the world. Yes, that totally is a joke from South Park. I just realized. I didn't even think about it until now, but now I get where the joke comes from. It's like the most most insulting thing that I think a Christian fundamentalist could think of. That's where I think it comes from. Anyway, so here's the thing, that full economic redistribution, where you take a large percentage of wealth from the rich, give it to the poor to try to balance things out. The problem is that whenever you continually rebalance this wealth to where no one ever becomes super wealthy, no one ever is extremely poor, you kind of constantly keep it even all across the board. And you have a system, a governmental system in place that constantly does this, right? Nobody ever has any desire to strive for anything. What motivation would I have and ambition would I have to achieve anything in my job, in my career, in my life, if everything's going to be equal anyway? Like, there's no reward for me. And people are base animals. We work off a reward system. Remember that survival instinct? Survival is the ultimate reward, but even through our lives outside of survival, we can still be trained with even the most basic reward systems. Why do you think that gambling or loot boxes are so damn popular? Is because people love that gratification. They love that reward mechanism, that dopamine release in their brain. That's exactly the same thing that's going on with a lot of financial semblances that people have in the world, is that they have it in their mind that even the poorest of people think that one day they can be rich. That really is what drives a lot of ambition. Some people aren't so ambitious. They just want to be given riches, right? They just want to magically be rich. And that can be seen a lot on YouTube with the amount of like just gross, silly channels that people have to have absolute garbage content with no substance to them. And instead, to try to make it look like they've grown somewhat, they go and engage in scams like sub for sub or whatever, right? Those are people that just want to sit around, not do anything, and still be successful. But most people that actually have a driving desire to be successful, they have ambition based upon the idea that they will receive a monetary reward for it, right? It's their individualism, their striving, their work that gain them financial wealth and success, right? Whereas, and that's one side of it. Like I said, it's a revolving door. This is not the one way or the other way, you know, right? At the same time, that going to the extreme leads to a small group that can continue to get all of the wealth and devise ways, since they have all the wealth, they have all the power, they can devise ways to where they continue to get all the wealth and other people are not able to get the wealth. That's where it goes too far, and that does happen. That's not that that's an imaginary thing, but the answer is not necessarily to strip away their wealth and give it to the poor. The answer would be, I don't know, it's very complicated, and my guess, and this is very uneducated, so I'm not very good on a lot of economics and stuff like that, so I'm gonna not get into that too much. But I would say that there are probably ideas and ways that people could essentially prevent the rich or these like higher end people from having too much control and give, and without necessarily money redistribution, just ensure that the poverty, the less equal economically, are able to still have a voice in control of the system, so that way they're not disadvantaged with power. Power oftentimes begets money, so if you give them some power to speak and a voice and a say in what happens, rather than the rich in the upper class having all of the say on the rules, which is sadly what usually happens nowadays, that I think would probably do it. But again, grain of salt, I'm not an expert. That could be the most idiotic statement ever made. Most likely is. So we'll just backtrack from that. In any case, my point is that anti-consumerism, first of all, doesn't always 100% oppose consumerism, and it's also its ideas are kind of careful. You have to be careful with ideologies because it's not always one way or the other way. Now, one piece on here, by the way, corporatocracy is a neologism. It's not necessarily a true thing, but going into anti-consumerism, one of the things that I was talking about with that imbalance is with corporations. And corporatocracy, like I said, complete neologism and not really a thing as of yet. It's not an accepted term, but it is a theoretical term that people might say exists today. And the reason why is because a lot of corporations or groups of corporations will have lobbyists in the government, at least in the US, that will lobby a lot of the lawmakers to make laws that benefit them. Or I shouldn't say necessarily lawmakers, but policymakers in general. They'll lobby policymakers to make laws or policies that benefit them. For example, a great example of that right now was Egypt Pie essentially pushing for rescinding the net neutrality rules back in December. Well, it's actually earlier than that. He's been doing it since he's been putting that in motion since he got put into the chairman spot, right? So essentially, with that in mind, there are a lot of instances of corporate influence on legislation, and that is a concern, and that is where anti-consumerism is something that's necessary as a position. So consumerism isn't always right. anti-consumerism isn't always right, but they're both necessary in their own place. Now, corporations have a significant influence on the regulations and regulators that monitor them. For example, Senator Elizabeth Warren in the United States explained that in December 2014 how an omnibus spending bill required to fund the government was modified late in the process to weaken baking regulations. The modification made it easier to allow taxpayer-funded bailouts of baking swaps entities, which the Dodd-Frank banking regulations prohibited. She singled out Citigroup, one of the largest banks, which had a role in modifying the legislation. She also explained how both Wall Street bankers and members of the government that formerly had worked on Wall Street stopped the bipartisan legislation that would have broken up the largest banks. She repeated that President Theodore Roosevelt's warning regarding powerful corporate entities that threaten the very foundation of democracy. Now, the thing is here, and you see it a lot, like there's a lot of famous, I don't know how long that ago was. Oh, that wasn't that long ago. People that value non-monetary rewards would still strive. The thing is that a lot of your monetary rewards, when I say monetary rewards, I should specify that as in wealth. And wealth isn't necessarily specifically money. You can have wealth in a lot of things. But for a lot of people, if you give them all, like if you redistribute wealth in general to everybody, where everybody has always the same wealth, I feel like that's going to essentially breed like innovation. Technological innovation, for example, is oftentimes created through people trying to compete financially, and that's very often seen. Or it is then also created by people who are ambitious and can get money from wealthy people. In the case of Elon Musk, if everybody had equal amounts of money, Elon Musk probably wouldn't necessarily be nearly as efficient of a salesman, and he may not be able to get the same amount of money. That's one point to kind of add in there. In any case, the thing is, talking about corporate legislation and all of that good fun stuff, the concern of corporate control can be seen, like it's very famous that the cigarette companies, tobacco companies, have legislated for a long time and kind of keeping a lot of bans and a lot of control from tobacco from hitting the large market, right? And that's something that a lot of people are kind of angry about, because you have these rich companies that are essentially making decisions that negatively impact the consumer, that a lot of times they don't know what's going on. Well, fortunately enough, tobacco companies, like there was such a large outcry against them that their lobbying just wasn't going to be successful, due to a lot of kind of, you could say, anti-consumerism like complaints against them. So they, of course, just moved to third world countries that don't have restrictions against smoking and started doing them there. Whatever. That's the nature of business, is that they prey on where they can get the money. But there have been a lot of cases of corporations having a lot of influence in governments around the world. And like, for example, I used to make the joke, and this is kind of a sick joke, but it wasn't necessarily untrue at the time, that if you would go into, if I'm remembering this correctly, I think it was the CEO of Sony could just like shoot somebody in downtown Tokyo and the cops would help him hide the body. Or the same thing for the CEO, then CEO of Samsung, could shoot somebody in downtown Seoul and the cops would help him hide the body. That's not true, right? They would be arrested, they would get in trouble, but the kind of the sick joke part of that is that those companies are so culturally powerful in those countries that there is probably a lot that they could get away with, and probably have, that we don't even know about because, you know, they keep it to themselves and keep it hidden. But and a lot of that, especially with Sony, comes, and Samsung both actually, comes from post-war era deregulations on those companies to try to spur the economies in those areas of the world, right? That's a lot of the reason why Samsung is so damn powerful, is because trying to get the economy rolling in South Korea required them to deregulate a lot of companies in order to get them moving. And now Samsung owns so much stuff all over the place that their portfolio is massive, and I think they've sold off a lot of their portfolio to other companies, and that's saying something. When you sell off whole program segments of your company to other companies, that makes a hell of a statement. Like, for example, anybody realize that Mitsubishi made TVs at one point in time? That's a lot of, because back in the day, you know, essentially all of those major Japanese companies after World War II were kind of given really broad abilities to buy and create monopolies in some segments. Well, they weren't really monopolies because there was competition, but they were given some really vague regulations to allow them to do a lot of stuff so they could spur the economy and get it going. But yeah, so in any case, hi Rose, hi, hello, evening. Also, hi Zyphon and stuff. But so the thing is that there has been a lot of history of consumer, or of corporate influence on governmental control in a lot of countries over a long period of time. And the thing is that when you talk about consumerism and you talk about the idea of the more quantitative one that I was talking about earlier, and kind of the definitions of trying to look at things from a broad perspective and how the market works, one of the pieces of that I talked about was the consumerism as a concept, that the marketplace itself is responsible for ensuring proper regulations of itself, right? I think that's part of where consumer education falls into the puzzle. So if you are properly educated and you know what the general things that a corporation should be doing, the moment that they step out and start doing stuff that they really shouldn't be doing, at that point, or at least that you feel they shouldn't be doing, you can actually say, hey, should they be doing that? It doesn't necessarily mean that you necessarily tell them they need to stop doing it. Just question it. Question. That's it. The reason for this topic, and as we're kind of closing up on here, because holy shit, we have been going for nearly 2 hours. No wonder I'm fucking coughing and yawning so damn much here. It's because I've been talking for 2 hours. God damn. Ugh. Anyway, to summarize this, the entire point of all of this, the main reason for me getting into this topic is because of the prevalence of folks that are kind of falling into the bad realm of consumerism, where they feel that not only that have they kind of come to that concept that we talked about of the commodity self, where they feel like the products that they have bought define their identity. And that's kind of a lot of the problems where you get, like, for example, the Xbox fanboy, for example, or Kev, as we joke, is the Sony PlayStation fanboy, right? Is that that person, that concept of a person, feels that purchasing that product has defined their identity. And, you know, as Kev jokes that he's a pony, right? He's a Sony pony. He is that person. It's a joke. It's a gag. It's a persona that he puts on based upon the fact that he finds people that are like that to be comical. But there are people out there that are like that. And the problem is that the people out there that are like that are inherently anti-consumer. By being a kind of a, as you might call it, a consumerist slave, you are actually anti-consumer, because you are essentially blindly following a brand, blindly doing whatever the brand wants, and then telling everybody else that they need to buy this and that they're stupid if they don't buy it. That's against the consumer. That's the consumer should be researching. You know, the concept that the consumer should be an informed decision maker in the marketplace, and that practices such as product testing, reviews, and the like should make the consumer informed. And there's some people that don't want that because they feel like any negative talk about their product reflects negatively upon them. Even though they haven't made the product, they weren't involved in creating the product, but just because they bought the product, they feel about that any negative opinion about it would reflect negatively upon them as an individual. And that's something that should be combated. That culture, that philosophy, that ideology that people have, that the product they buy defines them, is really something that I feel like is a major problem in society today. It's like your choices, what you want to do, does define you as an individual, the choices you make. The products that you own do not, however. If I want to choose to dye my hair blue, and if I want to choose to drive a pink Mazda Miata, those are choices that do define me as an individual. But me owning a Mazda Miata, like me owning a Mazda, does not make me a Mazda fanboy, right? That's where the line is drawn. And that's where I think a lot of it gets a little gray to a lot of people, where people get lost, is that they buy a Mazda Miata and then they have to buy the Mazda Miata hat and then the Mazda Miata shoes, and because they are so entwined into this society that they've built for themselves based upon Mazda. Silly. Anyway. Goddamn. Try mouth. I've been talking for way too damn long. It's been 2 hours. Holy shit. I'm gonna lose my voice from doing this. This was supposed to be the short stream night, guys. Short stream night that turned into like the 2-hour long yammering about consumerism. Ugh. I need to figure out a better system for this. This instead of being the Mortiel fallacy, this is gonna be called the Mortiel rambling, because I feel like that might be a more accurate description on there. In any case, so I think I'm going to throw, as long as she's not still, or she's not ending her stream, probably throw a host over to Anchor654, who's playing. Oh nope, she actually did end. So I lied. We're gonna be throwing a host over to Size16, who's playing Dragon Age 2, because he's apparently masochistic and stuff. In any case, I'm gonna get out of here before my head falls off from talking too much, if that's a real thing. If that is actually a medical condition, please send help immediately, because I apparently am losing my marbles. But we're gonna throw a host over to him, guys. I hope you all have a good night. Kev is supposed to be on tomorrow to stream some games. We'll see if that happens. If not, I believe his Twitter handle is @KevinN7. So tweet him out and let him know why the hell aren't you online. You should be streaming, and then maybe throw in a Sony Pony insult just for good measure. That's usually what I recommend. We'll be back one way or another on Saturday with the podcast, which will always be a good time. I think we have some good topics to discuss, which are going to be a lot of fun. I like Kev suggested one that I think is a pretty good topic that I think you guys will like. So join us on Saturday for the podcast. Hopefully join Thursday if Kev's streaming. Oh, I think Zyphon's also streaming. Yeah, Zyphon's streaming on Friday morning too. God damn, talking so much I'm getting hairs in my mouth. God, this is why you don't talk so much, guys. By the way, whoever that guy was, the famous guy in history that made like the 75-hour speech, how did you do it? I want to know. How do you talk for 75 hours? I'm running away, guys. Have fun. Be good to each other. Don't fall for the pitfalls. Remember, play games, not platforms. Question everything. Be skeptical, and vote for fuck. What fanboy could I be? Logitech, I guess. Yeah, vote for Logitech and stuff. Have a good night, guys.